This is Silent Valor, where hearts meet courage. Subscribe now, and thank you for giving me your support with just one click.
In the blazing heat of the Arizona desert, laughter echoed across the firing range. A group of young Marines, crisp in their uniforms, mocked the faded yellow rifle, calling it nothing more than a relic, a toy from a forgotten war. But behind that rifle sat an old man, silent and unshaken, his eyes piercing through distance and time. What they didn't know was that a single shot from that toy would summon a general, silence an army of doubters, and turn ridicule into legend. The desert sun pressed down with merciless weight, its heat shimmering over the sand and stone of Arizona's wide expanse, where a group of young Marines gathered at the firing range, their laughter sharp, careless, bouncing against the bleached earth. They stood in crisp uniforms, faces sunburned but proud, carrying themselves with the cocky energy of men who believed youth made them invincible. Corporal Daniel Jenkins, the loudest among them, stepped forward, his shadow falling long across the wooden bench where an old man sat. Jenkins was tall, broad-shouldered, his jaw sharp and perpetually clenched, a scar curling across his cheek, a remnant of a bar fight back home in Alabama that had made him quick to anger and slow to respect. He leaned forward, a grin spreading across his square face, his voice loud enough for everyone around to hear. "Old man, is that toy supposed to scare anyone? This isn't a Kansas yard sale. This is a Marine Corps range." The laughter of his comrades, including Private First Class Miller, a freckled boy barely 20 with a nervous laugh that always chased after Jenkins's words, rippled through the hot air. The object of their ridicule lay across the bench, a rifle painted in dull, faded yellow, its wooden stock scarred by time, its barrel gleaming faintly with the polish of care. To them, it looked ridiculous among the matte black precision rifles of modern warfare. To them, it was a joke. But the man who carried it was no joke. Thomas "Tom" Walker, 94 years old, sat quietly on a folding wooden chair, his frame lean, nearly frail, his shoulders slightly bent yet unbroken by time. His hair, once raven black, was now white as desert salt, cropped close but unruly in places. His face was a map of years, deep lines etched by storms, by battles, by loss, and by unspoken victories. His eyes, however, were what silenced those who dared look too long. Gray, steady, unfathomable, like wells that had once reflected the smoke of Normandy and the burning forests of Europe. He did not rise to Jenkins's taunts, nor did he even flinch. His hands, thin but strong, rested calmly on his knees. In his silence, there was both defiance and patience, and the stillness of it unsettled the younger Marines more than any harsh retort could. They wanted anger, a reaction, some confirmation that their laughter had struck him, but all they found was a wall of unshaken calm. Private Miller shuffled uneasily, glancing at Jenkins, whispering under his breath, "Maybe he's deaf, or just senile." Jenkins barked a laugh, but even as he laughed, something in Tom's eyes gnawed at him, a sense that this frail relic had seen things Jenkins could never imagine. And then, slowly, Tom turned his head toward the range, his gaze locking on the target nearly invisible in the desert haze, almost 4 kilometers away. His lips parted just slightly, as if about to speak for the first time since he had arrived. But what came out was not a word. It was the quietest of chuckles, so low it felt like it belonged to another time, another war. The sound alone made the laughter around him falter, and for the first time, Corporal Jenkins felt a flicker of doubt twist in his chest. The faint chuckle that had unsettled the Marines in the blistering heat was still hanging in the air when Tom Walker, without a word, slipped a trembling hand into the breast pocket of his faded khaki jacket and drew out an old laminated card. Its edges curled and cloudy with time, the plastic yellowed like parchment. Corporal Jenkins snatched it with the eagerness of a man convinced he would find reason to win his argument, his calloused hands turning it over in the light. His blue eyes, usually narrowed with swagger, widened in frustration as he read the details. Thomas Walker, access confirmed, veteran clearance intact. He rubbed his jaw with irritation, the scar on his cheek twitching, as if even his old wound resented being proven wrong. Tom remained still, his eyes locked on the hazy horizon where the target lay invisible to the naked eye. And in that moment, the desert dissolved before him. He was no longer in Arizona, but back in Normandy, 1984. The world green and gold beneath a low sky, heavy with rain. In his memory, a younger Tom pressed his chest against the damp earth, his cheek to the stock of his rifle, his breath steady despite the thunder of artillery in the distance. Beside him, Private Samuel "Sammy" Doyle whispered, a 19-year-old boy from Brooklyn, with a mop of curly brown hair, freckles, and a nervous smile that tried to disguise his fear. Sammy had been drafted straight from a corner grocery, where he once carried crates heavier than himself. And though he joked often, his voice trembled that day. "Tom, they're coming through the field. Can you hold them?" Tom had answered with silence then too, letting his eye rest on the blurred figure of an enemy officer moving across the wheat, his heartbeat a drum of inevitability. Back in Arizona, the laughter of the Marines faded as Jenkins muttered, "This has to be fake, some kind of trick." Yet he could not shake the unease pressing down on him. Tom's hands, resting quietly on his knees, tightened almost imperceptibly, knuckles pale as the whisper of the past pressed harder against the present. For an instant, he could still smell the damp soil of Normandy. Hear Sammy's last nervous joke cut short by machine gun fire, and feel the heavy weight of knowing his shot would decide not only his fate, but the lives of every man pinned behind him. His lips parted as though he might finally speak to Jenkins, but before a word could emerge, a new shadow fell across the bench. Heavy boots crunching against the gravel, and a low, authoritative voice cut through the air. "That card belongs to a man you should not be questioning." The gravel crunched as the new figure stepped forward, his voice calm but carrying authority. And when the Marines turned, they saw Gunny Harris, the civilian range officer who watched over them with the same sharp eyes he once had as a Marine gunnery sergeant. Harris was in his late 60s, his frame still broad though softened by age, his hair a thinning silver cropped short, and his jawline square beneath a neatly trimmed white beard. His skin was weathered, freckled by years of desert sun, and his eyes were steel blue, unblinking. The eyes of a man who had spent decades watching young recruits make the same arrogant mistakes. Known for fairness, but feared for blunt honesty, Harris had been shaped by the loss of his only son in Iraq, a grief that made him protective of every young Marine he supervised, though he rarely showed it in words. He stopped near the bench, his gaze sweeping over Jenkins and Miller, then landing on Tom with a recognition that chilled him. "That card isn't just plastic, Corporal," he said, his voice gravelly. "It belongs to a man whose silence weighs heavier than all your noise." Jenkins opened his mouth to retort, but faltered under Harris's stare, then scoffed and turned his frustration toward the rifle itself. He reached out again, his calloused fingers brushing the yellow-painted stock, and a thin flake of paint curled away, exposing the dark steel beneath. The instant contact was made, Tom's body stiffened, his mind ripped from the desert into another battlefield. He was back in Normandy, lying in wheat fields glowing gold under a gray sky, the air choked with smoke. His rifle gleamed faintly, painted yellow not as a flourish, but as a beacon, a desperate signal so Allied aircraft could find him and the trapped paratroopers he defended. That color had been his lifeline, a flag in the storm of war, saving both himself and an entire unit pinned down by German fire. In the present, his hand instinctively moved toward the rifle, not to stop Jenkins, but to steady himself, as though touching it grounded him against the violent rush of memory. Harris saw the change in Tom's eyes, the sudden hardness like tempered steel, and his stomach clenched, for he realized the younger Marines had awakened something dangerous. Miller swallowed, whispering, "Sir, maybe we should just let him be." But Jenkins, pride wounded and voice rising, sneered, "What's the big deal? It's just old metal and bad paint." At that moment, Tom's gaze lifted, and for the first time his lips parted to form words, his voice low and edged with memory. "That yellow is blood and fire." Harris's voice trembled as he stood rigidly, his gaze never leaving the old man with the yellow rifle. And though the younger Marines still smirked uneasily, they could not ignore the shift in the air. He reached into the breast pocket of his worn range vest, pulling out a black flip phone that looked out of place in the modern world, yet suited him perfectly, its plastic case scratched from years of service. Harris dialed with deliberate slowness, his thumb pressing each button as though the act itself carried weight. The phone rang twice before a voice answered. Lieutenant Mark Reynolds, the base command duty officer, young, ambitious, and still carrying the sheen of new responsibility. Reynolds was tall and lean, with sandy blonde hair cropped close and a sharp nose that gave his face a hawk-like quality, though behind his confidence was the insecurity of a man who had never seen combat. "This is Reynolds," he said briskly, though Harris could hear the fatigue in his tone, the sound of a junior officer buried under endless reports. Harris's voice dropped low, almost reverent. "Lieutenant, this is Gunny Harris at the range. We have a problem, a name you need to run up the chain. Walker, Thomas Walker." There was silence on the other end, then the rustle of papers, the clicking of a keyboard, and finally Reynolds' skeptical reply. "Should I know that name, Gunny? Is he a retired colonel? Some senator?" Harris clenched his jaw, his weathered face hardening, every line deepening with the memory of whispers he'd once heard in hushed Marine Corps briefings. "They called him the Ghost of Normandy," he said quietly, almost to himself. The nickname rolled out like a secret not meant to be spoken aloud, and Jenkins, standing nearby, furrowed his brow, muttering, "Ghost of what?" Reynolds' tone shifted from irritation to confusion, then unease. "That file is locked, Harris. Eyes only clearance above my grade. Who exactly is sitting on my range?" Harris looked again at Tom, who remained perfectly still, his hand resting lightly on the yellow stock as though he were holding back the weight of another world. "Someone you don't want these kids provoking," Harris said, his voice a growl. "Run it up the chain fast, Lieutenant, or we'll be reading eulogies before sundown." A sharp wind gusted across the desert, lifting sand in stinging swirls, and as Harris lowered the phone, his face pale with dread, the distant roar of engines began to rise on the horizon, a sound that did not belong to training day. The sound of engines grew louder until the desert air trembled with their approach, and a convoy of dark green military vehicles surged across the range, throwing dust high into the sky like a storm on wheels. The Marines who had mocked moments earlier now stood frozen, their laughter silenced as headlights cut through the haze. The first vehicle, a rugged Humvee, skidded to a halt with the precision of men used to urgency, followed by two black SUVs whose tinted windows reflected nothing but the blazing sun. The doors swung open almost in unison, and from the second SUV emerged Brigadier General Evelyn Harper, her presence commanding the very ground beneath her boots. Harper was in her late 50s, tall and lean, her frame wiry but strong, the result of decades of carrying the weight of both armor and command. Her skin was a bronze tan, sunburnt from years in the deserts of Afghanistan, and her short-cropped black hair, streaked with silver, framed a face carved sharp by time and battle. Her brown eyes, hard as flint yet intelligent, scanned the range with immediate recognition of the imbalance. Young arrogance on one side, silent gravity on the other. She strode forward, every step measured, her immaculate uniform crisp, the single silver star on her chest gleaming beneath the pitiless Arizona light. Without hesitation, she stopped before Tom Walker, heels snapping together, and delivered a salute that was not perfunctory, but reverent, a gesture reserved for legends rather than superiors. Her voice rang clear, unyielding. "Mr. Walker, it is an honor to have you here." The young Marines gawked, Jenkins paling as though the sun had drained his blood, his jaw opening but only fragments of words tumbling out. He's just a civilian, isn't he? Who is he?" General Harper turned her gaze upon him, the warmth gone from her eyes, her tone clipped like the crack of a rifle. "Civilian? This man wrote the very sniper doctrine you train under. The world learned to breathe and aim because of him." Jenkins' chest tightened as shame pressed down harder than the desert heat, and Miller shuffled his feet, wishing he could disappear into the dust. Harris, standing nearby, exhaled slowly, relief mixing with dread, for he knew the storm had only just begun. Harper's gaze lingered on Tom for a long moment, respect written in every line of her face. And then she pivoted sharply toward the distant road, her eyes narrowing at a growing cloud beyond the horizon where another set of vehicles was fast approaching, engines louder, faster, heavier, the kind reserved not for ceremony, but for emergencies. The second convoy roared closer, dust rising in thick curtains as if the desert itself was holding its breath. And the young Marines instinctively straightened their postures, uncertain whether to salute or simply stand frozen. Tom Walker's voice had just rolled over them like a low thunder, warm yet unyielding, and his words about respect and arrogance still hung in the air when the next wave of engines died in unison. From the lead vehicle, a dark SUV with reinforced panels, stepped Colonel Richard Hayes, the base commander. Hayes was in his early 60s, stocky and broad-chested, with a square jaw permanently shadowed by gray stubble, his close-cropped hair salt and pepper, and deep creases carved into his face by years of commanding from deserts to jungles. His dark eyes were tired but sharp, a man who had learned to measure every second, every soldier, every casualty. Once a battlefield strategist in the Gulf War, he carried himself with the gravity of a man haunted by the memory of soldiers lost to decisions he alone had signed. He glanced briefly at Harper, his lips tightening in silent acknowledgement, then turned toward Tom with an expression somewhere between awe and disbelief. Behind him walked a woman in civilian clothes, Dr. Emily Carter, a historian in her 40s with chestnut brown hair tied back in a loose bun, glasses slipping slightly down her nose, and a tall, willowy frame wrapped in a beige coat despite the heat. Her pale skin was already reddening under the sun, but her amber eyes gleamed with academic hunger, the eyes of someone who had spent her life chasing fragments of history, never expecting to see a legend standing alive before her. "General Harper," Hayes said, his voice gravelly but controlled. "You failed to mention the range had. This guest." His gaze locked on Tom, and his voice softened, nearly reverent. "Sir, it has been a long time since anyone's whispered your name out loud." Harper's tone was firm, The young ones needed a reminder. Tom's hand stayed on the rifle, steady as though it were the only anchor tying him to both past and present. Dr. Carter stepped forward, clutching a worn leather notebook to her chest, her voice quivering with excitement as she blurted, "Mr. Walker, you're supposed to be a ghost in the records. They erased you." A hush fell again, the desert wind dropping into silence, as every Marine, every officer, and even Harper herself turned toward Tom, waiting for the old sniper to answer the one question hanging like a blade in the air. Had the Ghost of Normandy truly returned? And what had been erased from history? 1 week later, the Arizona range was transformed into something closer to a ceremony than a training ground. The heat shimmering over rows of officers, enlisted men, and even a handful of civilians invited quietly to witness history. General Harper stood tall at the edge of the platform, her uniform impeccable, while Colonel Hayes maintained a rigid stance beside her, his dark eyes locked on the distant horizon. Dr. Emily Carter clutched her notebook close, her chestnut hair tied back against the desert breeze, lips pressed tightly as though to keep her emotions from spilling into the open. The young Marines who had once mocked now stood in respectful silence, their boots planted firm, their eyes humbled by the weight of what they had learned. Corporal Jenkins in particular seemed transformed, his square jaw tense, but his eyes softer, his scarred cheek flushed with something far deeper than shame. An awakening. He glanced at Private Miller, who stood beside him, the freckled boy no longer nervous, but resolute, as though he too had grown in the shadow of the legend before them. Tom Walker lay prone on a simple mat of canvas, his old bones settling into the position like muscle memory, older than any man present. The yellow rifle rested upon a sandbag, its faded paint glinting dully in the merciless sun. He adjusted the scope with hands that trembled slightly, not from weakness, but from the immeasurable weight of memory. The target shimmered at 3,800 meters. So far it seemed a mirage. The range was silent except for the whisper of the wind, and even the cicadas seemed to hush as Tom drew in a breath, steady, slow, letting time itself pause. For a full minute, he did not move, becoming part of the desert, until at last his fingers squeezed the trigger. The crack of the rifle split the air, echoing like a thunderclap against stone cliffs. Seconds stretched like eternity before the monitor blinked to life, a single green dot glowing at dead center. A gasp rolled through the crowd, followed by a silence heavier than any cheer, until finally applause erupted, not raucous, but reverent. Harper saluted again. Hayes bowed his head, and even Carter wiped at her eyes, scribbling furiously to capture what she had seen. Jenkins stepped forward after the shot, removing his cap, his voice raw but honest. "Sir, I was wrong. Thank you." Tom lifted his eyes, offering a small smile, one that carried both forgiveness and finality. For once, the ghosts of Normandy seemed lighter on his shoulders, and as the sun dipped lower over the desert, the Marines realized they were not merely witnessing a shot, but the closing of a circle. The legend of the ghost had not ended in secrecy. It lived, breathing, teaching, and it had left them with the truest lesson of all, that respect, like a perfect shot, lasts forever. Legends are not just written on battlefields. They live in the lessons of humility, respect, and courage that guide our everyday lives. May we honor those who came before us and carry their strength into how we treat one another each day. Thank you for watching this story. If it moved you, please share it with someone you care about. Leave your thoughts in the comments and subscribe to our channel for more stories of hidden heroes. Wishing you peace, health, and kindness on your journey ahead.